like to know things.
So I want to talk a little bit about this thing called, variously, the mental health liberation movement, the anti-psychiatry movement, the movement against psychiatric oppression, however you want to call it. You know, a lot of people call it anti-psychiatry. But what's remarkable is that we do have this movement, and it's a liberation movement. It's a liberation against oppression. Oppression is a systematic mistreatment of members of a group simply because they're part of that group. In this case, called identified as a mentally ill person, right? So you have racism, oppression against people of color, sexism against women, gay and lesbian oppression, etc. And here we're talking about psychiatric oppression. The purpose of oppression, first of all, in terms of basic oppression theory, is very important to just understand, and I'm not going to go into it here, but basically just understand that it's economically driven. You know, the purpose of dividing different groups of people amongst themselves and getting them hurting each other and putting each other down and everything is to distract from the real issues that need to be faced in the society and in the culture. And so it really is economically driven. But there's specific dynamics of how it works. In the case of psychiatric oppression, let me just say a couple of things. One is, key point is that psychiatry suppresses people, and suppresses especially their ability to heal by this natural built-in mechanism that we have called emotional discharge, emotional expression, verbal expression, talking it out. You know, psychiatric drugs and electroshock and other suppressive kind of actions on the part of psychiatry act to suppress that dynamic. They suppress the ability to feel, they suppress the ability to think. Those are necessary in order to kind of liberate ourselves from various distress patterns and hurts and to be able to think more clearly and be more powerful in our actions. So that's a major effect of psychiatric oppression. Another one I call the magic trick. It's like, voila, magic. You know, once you identify somebody as mentally ill, meaning they have a biological or genetic defect, according to that belief system of biological psychiatry, then you've absolved everybody from responsibility to think any further about what might really be going on. Because you've explained it. Oh, that child is attention deficit, or that person is clinically depressed, or oh, there's a schizophrenia person over there, right? Meaning they have an inherited genetic defect, or they have a chemical imbalance, or they have a neurological defect somehow. And that explains it. So then they just need the medicine to treat their illness, right? As opposed to what might really be going on. You know, what might really be going on and how our society and community is structured in such a way that we're creating distress in people. You know, how are we dealing with our food supplies? How are we dealing with how we nourish and support people? How are we dealing emotionally in our families, in our communities? How are we doing in the area of our relationships? How are we doing in areas of social and economic justice? It's like, voila, that's gone. Everybody's absolved of responsibility. It's just you have a genetic or biological defect. That's a major aspect of psychiatric oppression. The third is that psychiatry acts to enforce the norms. I call it the enforcer. To enforce the norms of the culture. So if the norm is slavery, then a slave that runs away is given a psychiatric name. This is a true story. A doctor named Samuel Cartwright back in the 1840s created a new psychiatric illness called drapetomania. It means slaves who run away. And it says caused by their mental illness. It's not caused by the oppressive institution of slavery, right? So fast forward to today, a child who's having trouble in a factory school and doesn't fit in for whatever reason. The problem's not with the factory schools and the community of support around that. The problem is that child has a neurological, biological defect called ADHD. It enforces the norms under the guise of medicine in this case. So that's what we're talking about, oppression and some of the mechanisms of how it works. Remembering that it's economically driven, of course. The pharmaceutical industries particularly profit immensely from this particular belief system and oppressive practice. So it's natural when you have a form of oppression, whether it's racism or sexism or gay and lesbian oppression or psychiatric oppression, that eventually you're going to have a liberation movement that arises, because the nature of human beings is to throw off the shackles and throw off the chains. That's a pretty good metaphor in this case. You know, in fact, that's one way of looking a little bit at the history of psychiatric oppression and the attempt to liberate ourselves from psychiatric oppression. In fact, one of the famous images of maybe going on 3 centuries ago is the image of Philippe Pinel in France removing the shackles, the chains from the mentally ill people in the institutions in France. And so that's an image that you see still emblazoned when you look at history of psychiatry textbooks and stuff like that. They were kept in chains in dungeons. Okay? Fast forward a couple hundred years to 50 years or so ago in the United States of America, and you have the books coming out about snake pit asylums and the people in the back wards, again in that kind of degenerated, degraded condition, and so they led to call those places snake pits. And the scandal was exposed with the images of that, and the need to and desire of being more humane in terms of how we relate to people. So this has a long history. You know, this movement against psychiatric oppression is not new. I just gave you a couple of examples. What is new is that recently, in the last several decades, you've had large numbers of survivors, psychiatric survivors, I call them, you know, people who have been identified as patients treated by doctors in the mental health care system, right? Now then you have large numbers of those people mobilizing and saying, this care I was supposedly given in the name of benevolent medicine, I'm now calling it an atrocity, and I want to stop it and make sure it doesn't happen to other people. And it's important to understand when you're talking about anti-psychiatry or the mental health liberation movement or whatever you want to call it, that it's driven and fueled and given life by the brave individuals who have been hurt by that system and then come forward to speak out against it. And there's countless numbers of those who inspire me. My friend Leonard Frank is a good example. He edited the book, The History of Shock Treatment. He has the current electroshock quotationary on our endofshock.com website. Hurt really badly by insulin and coma shock 50 years ago, he emerged and became a leader of the movement against psychiatric oppression. He was part of the founding group of the Network Against Psychiatric Assault in California that literally stopped electroshock for a little while in Berkeley, California, and literally wreaked havoc with some of the institutions that hurt people really badly out there. So he's an example. Individuals all over the place, survivors, really drive this movement. Some of you may have heard about the recent hearings last year and this year at the Food and Drug Administration around the use of antidepressants, first with children and then in the last couple of months with adults. All around the issue that these drugs, these so-called serotonin drugs, SSRIs, cause suicidal dynamics in a percentage of people who take them. Okay? That's pretty oppressive. That's pretty harmful. That's very, very damaging and dangerous. That information was suppressed by the industry that promotes the drugs, but eventually it was the people who came forward in those hearings and demanded that at the very least the Food and Drug Administration warn people about the dangers of those drugs. That's an anti-psychiatry action driven by the people who had been hurt by those drugs that they were told would help them. That's an example.